I just wanted to talk for really only a few minutes about the book that I'm just finishing, and I'm actually also just finished an article called Ruderal Ecologies, rethinking nature, migration, and the urban landscape in Berlin, and that's coming out actually in May next month in Cultural Anthropology, so if you want to check it out. But I'm working on the book right now, and it's called Ruderal City, Ecologies of Migration and Urban Life in Berlin. And the ruderal is, or let's put it differently, Berlin, I think, is a really good city to think about the ruderal. And in my book, I kind of engage with both the history of ruderal ecologies in Berlin on a kind of historical and ethnographic level, but also I'm trying to develop the kind of idea of the ruderal and the ruderal analytic as really a way of thinking about the city. And so I'll say a little bit more about that. But basically, what happened in Berlin was that after World War II, the city was really heavily bombed in order to bring the fascist regime to an end. And Berlin lay in rubble for a really long time because of the political situation. The idea in a lot of German cities was to remove the rubble out, because a lot of German cities were really heavily destroyed from the aerial bombing, and so the idea was to remove the traces of the bombings as quickly as possible, because they were a reminder of the fascist regime and the Holocaust, right? And the kind of idea emerged of life emerging out of ruins, and that kind of became part of the national imaginary of Berlin. Actually, the whole term "rising from ruins" became part of the East German national anthem, and so in Berlin it was a little bit of a different situation because of the political division, and the city was divided first into 4 parts and then into 2 parts with the Berlin Wall. And so a lot of the rubble spaces from the bombings and the kind of destroyed landscape was still there within the city for a really long time. And that kind of created a unique situation actually for specifically West Berlin botanists, because they were basically locked into the city. They kind of lost their usual field sites in the immediate countryside because of the Berlin Wall, right? You have to kind of imagine that they were in West Berlin and they couldn't get to their usual field sites. And so they started kind of turning their view towards the city and started specifically studying the rubble vegetation and the vegetation that was growing in the former bombed sites. And so I interviewed some of these botanists. One plant that they studied was this plant called sticky goosefoot, Chenopodium botrytis, which some of you may know, which usually grows in kind of warmer Mediterranean climates. And all of a sudden, after the war, it popped up really widely. It really was thriving in the rubble spaces after the war. And so the botanists were like, what's going on? And they also studied a whole other variety of other plants. But basically what they kind of found as they were turning their view towards the city, that there was a specifically urban vegetation that was popping up that really mirrored in some ways the history of the city. And a lot of the plants that they studied had kind of come into the city via imported, via like the packaging materials of imported goods, via trains, all of the transport networks, sometimes even on the boots of refugees or soldiers who had crossed the city. And so there were all these theories about how some of these plants had entered the city. And so these botanists specifically started studying the ecology of these bombed sites, and what they found was a very large diversity and heterogeneity of plants growing in these places, and but also they found a lot of they found out that the temperatures of the city actually had risen over the last century because of urbanization, industrialization processes, and additional artificial heat sources. And so the cities are actually, and specifically Berlin, is much warmer than in the countryside. And so some of these plants that usually would only grow in the Mediterranean all of a sudden started also popping up in Berlin. And so basically they started studying this ecology that is really kind of the outcome of a whole variety of different processes, of migration processes, of the war, of, in the German case, specifically also the history of nationalism and fascism and the bombings themselves. And so I'm kind of using this kind of attention to the ruderal ecology of the city as a way to really think about how these different historical processes come together, how both globalization, migration processes, but also the history of nationalism, of war, and also of environmental destruction and climate change, how they all kind of converge in kind of shaping different ecologies of the city. And so my argument in the book is to kind of really use the notion of the ruderal as a way of thinking across different registers of migration, of the history of racism, of capitalism, and to kind of really think across different registers. And so in the rest of the book, I'm kind of developing that as an analytic to kind of think about, not to equate people with plants, but to kind of think about how people, plants, and other organisms kind of get entangled in projects of nation making in the logic of capital and modernist planning, but also how they traverse them in unexpected ways. And I think that's also where the ruderal really comes in, as kind of the stuff that is unplanned, right? And that kind of the life that emerges in unexpected ways. And that is really deeply ambivalent. I'm very cautious also not celebrating the ruderal, right? Because it's also, it's also a cautionary tale, I think. And so I have all kinds of different chapters. It's a very eclectic project, and I'm really kind of trying to use this idea of thinking across registers of how humans and plants and other organisms get wrapped up in kind of projects of nation making and how they also traverse it. And so I have a chapter on urban gardening, specifically in migrant neighborhoods and human-plant relationships, about barbecuing in the city, and about trash, and how also people, human bodies kind of also get kind of racialized on the basis of their relationship to the environment, and the kind of inappropriate, or supposedly inappropriate relationship to the environment. And then I have a chapter on refugees who live in the forest edges of Berlin, in former military bases, on the ruins of former military bases, and kind of their relationships to the environment. And anyway, I don't want to talk too long. I think I'm, is that fine? Okay, cool. I think that's it, and I'm super excited to be here this weekend. So looking forward to more discussion. Thanks.